And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
The Intercept's Nick Turse reports who could have predicted the U.S. war in Somalia would fail. Well, the Pentagon did. A 2007 Defense Department study found glaring problems with America's Horn of Africa campaign plan. The U.S. military plunged ahead anyway. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled, I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Nick Turse writes, the Pentagon has known of fundamental flaws with U.S. military operations in the Horn of Africa for nearly 20 years, but has nonetheless forged ahead, failing to address glaring problems. And this is according to a 2007 study that was obtained by the Intercept. Quote, there is no useful, shared conception of the conflict, says the Pentagon study, and the instruments of national power are not balanced, which results in excessive reliance on the military instrument. There is imbalance within the military instrument as well. Dr. Horne, that sounds to me very simply to say they should be paying more attention to diplomatic avenues and channels instead of trying to bring democracy at the barrel of a gun. Dr. Gerald Horne.
Well, that's the understatement of the century. But perhaps it would be useful to provide some geographic and historical background so that our audience can better understand these points that you have raised so sagely. Somalia is in East Africa. It has a lengthy coastline that encompasses partly the Red Sea. That is to say, it has proximity to Kenya, which is a major outpost for British and U.S. imperial interests stretching back decades. It also has close proximity to Djibouti, which is the site not only of a U.S. military base, but of a French military base as well. And likewise, it shares proximity to Ethiopia, by some measures, the second most populous nation on the African continent behind Nigeria, the headquarters of the African Union, and its capital in Addis Ababa, across the Red Sea from Yemen, which is now enmeshed in a kind of conflict with Israel in terms of seeking to bar ships traversing the Red Sea to the Suez Canal to reach the Israeli port of Eilat, which in turn has brought on military attacks on Yemen from the United States and its allies. And that should underscore the geostrategic importance of Somalia, which helps to explain why the U.S. military has been waging a kind of high to low intensity conflict there for a number of decades. Like so many problems of U.S. foreign policy, the roots of the current problem can be found in the Cold War. What I mean is, in the 1970s, Somalia, believe it or not, was seeking to pursue a path of non-capitalist development leading towards socialism. By 1974, its neighbor, speaking of Ethiopia, had overthrown His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie, and it embarked on a similar non-capitalist path of development, with both nations having positive relations of a sort to Moscow, the then Soviet Union. This was too much for U.S. imperialism to accept, and Somalia was induced to attack Ethiopia on this claim that Ethiopian territory in what is called the Ogaden was actually Somali territory. That, of course, weakened both and led Somalia on this downward path involving the rise of this group that the United States is now attacking called Al-Shabaab, which the United States characterizes as so-called Islamic fundamentalists. Of course, Somalia is predominantly a Muslim nation. That, of course, helps to obscure an ampler point, which is that Somalia is part of a kind of Cold War 2.0 as we speak. It not only involves the contestation and jousting with Russia and China, it also involves the United States concerned about a nation we had thought was a U.S. ally. I'm speaking of Turkey or Turkiye, which is the power behind the throne in Mogadishu, the Somalia capital, providing everything from garbage disposal to security at the airport. Turkiye is playing an increasingly important role in many parts of Africa where you have Muslim majorities, and Turkiye's interests are not always in accord with the interests of U.S. imperialism. Of course, you see that being played out today in Ukraine, where Turkiye has a foot in both camps of both having positive relations with Moscow and serving as a sieve through which goods can be transported to Russia, while at the same time supplying drones for the Ukrainians by which they can combat the Russian military. It should not come as a shock to your audience, I'm sure, that Somalia also has uranium, natural gas, copper, and gold. And the conflict with Ethiopia still simmers, made even more complicated by the fact that the Ethiopian regime of late has sought to open relations with Somaliland, which is a breakaway from the larger Somalia, which has enraged Somalia and threatens to plunge Somalia and Ethiopia into a conflict rivaling that of the 1970s. But again, there are larger stakes at play because until recently, Kenya, as noted, a major outpost of U.S. imperial interest, was dickering to send police to Haiti, but that obviously is off the table now in light of the resignation of Prime Minister Henry, who had recently visited Nairobi. We also know that Sudan, another neighbor of Somalia, is now plunged into a major internal conflict involving millions of refugees and internally displaced persons. And of course, Sudan had been enticed to sign the so-called Abraham Accords, that is to say, a kind of de facto treaty with Israel. I dare say that that's probably off the table as well. So in light of this article that you just cited by Nick Turse, I really don't expect the United States to be pulling back from Somalia anytime soon because of its natural resources, because of its geostrategic position, abutting Kenya and neighboring the Red Sea and neighboring Ethiopia, etc. So I'm afraid to say that the beat goes on.
Speaking of Haiti, which you just brought up, there are reports that the Haitian prime minister has resigned. He can't return to his country. So considering what happened to the last prime minister at the hands of U.S. imperialism, might be a good idea. He may have wisely moved to save his own hide. Certainly, we are now hearing, of course, that the Kenyans are saying they won't send their troops until such time as a Haitian government is formed, probably by U.S. imperialism. Your thoughts on the unrest and instability in Haiti?
Well, the current crisis in Haiti was ignited, as you suggested, by the assassination of President Moïse approximately 3-odd years ago. Interestingly enough, now there are allegations that his spouse, who was in bed with him at the time that he was killed, is somehow implicated in his downfall. I'm not sure if that will actually play out, but certainly that allegation has been made. Like Somalia as well, we cannot ignore the economic interests involved. Haiti, of course, is a repository of many natural resources, including bauxite, copper, gold. And indeed, as baseball season begins to open shortly, we should not forget that Major League Baseball, to a large extent, are manufactured by Haitian cheap labor as we speak. But as with Somalia, I think a trip down memory lane would help to provide the context for a deeper comprehension of this current crisis, despite the fact that historians oftentimes group the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, with the revolt against British rule, 1776, that led to the formation of the United States of America. I think that that's a mischaracterization insofar as the creation of the United States of America led to a great leap forward for enslavement of Africans, thousands in 1776, millions by 1865 at the time of the abolition of that inhumane, odious commerce. And as well, not surprisingly, grouping Haiti and the United States together in this so-called age of revolution is like drawing a comparison between oil and water. They're both liquid, but that's about all that they share in common, because Haiti was a successful revolt of the unpaid sector of the working class. And since that took place over 200 years ago, the U.S. imperialists have had Haiti in the crosshairs. They tried to destabilize the regime more than once. They supported France when it compelled Haiti at gunpoint to pay reparations to enslavers over 200 years ago. U.S. covert operatives helped to engineer one of their early successes in 1844 when they split the island in two, helping to create the Dominican Republic. And of course, relations between the DR and Haiti since that time have been star-crossed, to put it mildly. Of course, Washington thought it had reason to go after Haiti, since, after all, Haiti was implicated in a number of slave revolts in the Americas, not only in the Caribbean and in South America, but also in the United States itself. The Gabriel's Revolt in Virginia, 1800, Digmart-Vesey, 200 years ago in South Carolina, just to name a few. And so, to fast forward, what happens is that in the 20th century, the United States occupied Haiti from 1915 to about 1934, at the time of the rise of the Duvalier dictatorship. A few decades after the end of the occupation, the United States was transfixed and somehow focused unduly on the Cuban Revolution, which caused it to make deals with the Duvalier dictatorship in an anti-Cuban fashion, which helped to keep that dictatorship in power. But finally, there was a breath of fresh air when, about 20-odd years ago, the former cleric Jean Aristide, came to power, but then he was dislodged in a U.S.-backed coup d'etat and then kicked out of the country, deposited unceremoniously in the Central African Republic before seeking exile in South Africa. And that helps to explain the current unrest, because the United States has been bent upon making sure that no progressive-leaning regime comes to power in Haiti. And that has led to the present crisis, where you have this unpopular Prime Minister, Ariel Henry, who has just resigned, who has been under siege by paramilitary forces who prevented him from landing in the capital after returning from Nairobi. He's now stuck in Puerto Rico and may be forced to seek exile permanently in Puerto Rico. Just recently, the neighbors, CARICOM, the Caribbean community, led by Guyana, but including Jamaica, Barbados, of course, have talked about some sort of transition. Hopefully they will involve not only the Haitian stakeholders, but perhaps the most important nation in the Caribbean, speaking of Cuba. But alas, the United States, which is seeking to overthrow the Cuban Revolution, just as it sought to overthrow the legacy of the Haitian Revolution, will probably block that, which is not good news for the emergence of a thriving, successful Haitian Republic.
Request for U.S. election observers slammed by South African official. Pretoria will block any attempts at interference in upcoming elections. Your thoughts of the dynamics here and what's at play? What's at the root of what's happening right now with South African elections?
Well, what's happening is that the United States is very upset with the regime in Pretoria. I know that there are many who feel that the current African National Congress government has not carried forth on a progressive legacy, but I think that they have neglected to understand the opposition from the U.S. and its allies, stemming from the fact that South Africa is a member in good standing of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which the United States perceives correctly as challenging the hegemony of the G7, the United States, the Western Europeans, and Japan. South Africa spearheaded the case in the International Court of Justice against U.S. ally, speaking of Israel. And of course, there is reason to suspect that the United States and its sidekick in London might be joined in this litigation as aiders and abettors of genocide, which casts a shadow over the White House and the State Department and the Pentagon. In return, the U.S. Congress is threatening to remove South Africa from the so-called benefits of AGOA, the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. But if that takes place, that will only serve to drive South Africa deeper into the embrace of China and Russia, and also Iran, with which South Africa has positive relations. I should also say that every cloud has a silver lining, and in light of the fact of this downturn in relations with Pretoria, Washington has sought leverage by seeking to improve relations with neighboring Angola, which Washington tried to block its independence by aligning with apartheid South Africa in the 1970s. Only a Cuban dispatching of troops helped to foil that diabolical plan. And only last week, Washington eased national sanctions against neighboring Zimbabwe, although it tightened sanctions against the leaders. But in return, Zimbabwe has kicked out the U.S. Agency of International Development, so that maneuver has not worked out well. So the prognosis is probably that there will be further complications in relations between Pretoria and Washington.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.